Hello, it's Mr. Molo for a lesson about graphing absolute value equations. So now we're going to be graphing these absolute value problems, and this is the one lesson that we're not going to get anything linear. So you'll see based on this graph right here on the picture, it's going to be a V shape. So all of these graphs today in the next 2 days, and when you take the test, are all going to be V-shaped graphs. So you won't get a straight line. So if you got a straight line, something went wrong. And so again, you're pretty much plugging in numbers and doing whatever the problem is. So some of these absolute value ones might be pretty simple, because if you put in the absolute value of -2 for x, well, it's 2. -1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1. Some of them might have a little more math to do. So like this one says -2 times the absolute value of x. So if I put in -2 for x, well, the absolute value of -2 is 2 times -2 is going to give us -4, if that wants to work for me. There it is. And then kind of the same thing here. So -1 for x, absolute value of -1 is 1, -2 times 1, -2, and so on for this blue graph. And you'll kind of see a little bit of a trend here. This blue graph is negative, so that V is going to be facing down. So that's another way to tell if you're doing it right or wrong, because of the way if it's going up or down. Like this one right here, it's -1/2. Well, I know if I plug in all these numbers, like -2, absolute value of -2 is 2, times -1/2 is -1. I know for this red graph, I'll also get a downward graph. Okay? And you'll see none of them have like a +3 or a -2 or anything like that. So that means they're all going to be on this y-axis. So there's some different tips and tricks that we can kind of learn when we start graphing things like this. You also see that the smaller the number is in front of x, the wider the graph is going to be. So if this was like 100x, it'd be a really skinny graph going here. But since it's -1/2 x, well then it's a little fatter and wider. We can kind of look at these positive ones now, so pretty much exactly the same, except they're going to be positive. So -2 and 1, 1/2, 0, 0. Okay, so all these, so our green graph, you'll see is pretty much going to be the opposite of the red graph, because it's pretty much the opposite. 1/2 x, -1/2 x, so they're kind of opposite. Same thing with this blue graph and orange graph, it looks like, is a positive 2x. So our numbers are all basically going to be opposite. So if you plug in a +2 versus a -2, it'll be the same for both graphs. So you kind of see orange graph and blue graph are pretty much opposite, where there's a -2x versus a +2x. So this is what I was talking about, where it might have a little bit more here. So again, if you plug in whatever you want for x, and then you'll get whatever your answer is for y. You have to make sure you get the 0 though, because otherwise you might be graphing a straight line and not know that it's absolute value. So you have to find whatever this is to make it equal 0. And we'll talk about that later. It's called the axis of symmetry. Okay, and now you kind of see that this says +2, and it's moved over 2 spots. Okay, kind of the same thing here for this blue graph. Again, plugging in those numbers for x, you get these numbers for y. And you'll kind of see again, now it says -2, it's going to be moved over 2 spots again for that 2. And you'll see it's kind of opposite because it's absolute value. So the red, the +2 you would assume go to the right. But it's kind of opposite because it's absolute value. But just know that it's going to be shifted. Just because it says +2 right there, and these graphs didn't say plus anything, it's going to be shifted a little bit. Okay, kind of the same thing here. Now that it's outside of the problem, that'll change it again a little bit. So we'll kind of see, now this shifted it down 2. So absolute value of x -2 shifts it down 2. Here, absolute value of x +2, see how that's one problem there? That changes how it shifts versus how this problem would shift. So important to kind of keep track of all these things, even if you don't remember where it's going to shift. We're still making a table for it. I don't expect you to do any of this in your head. you're still going to be making a table for what the graph should look like. But just know in your head, oh, hey, there's a -2, it should shift somewhere. Or when you're doing multiple choice questions, well, you know if it's a -2 and it shifts 5 spots to the left, even if you can't remember if it moves left or right, you know it's not going to move 5 spots. So that's kind of what it's talking about here. So the transformation here. So we know the slope and things like that. And this is the stuff that you probably won't get into until next year. But you can kind of see here that number in front of the x means how narrow or wide it's going to be. So how skinny or fat is what I said earlier. That number that's inside the absolute value moves it left or right. And then that number outside the absolute value is going to move it up or down. So if you want to write this down to kind of see how it's going to move, that's good. You can do that, but remember that we'll probably just be graphing all of these anyway with a table. I don't expect you to be like, oh, x -2 -3. I know where that's going to be. I can do that in my head. I don't expect that. So we're still going to be making in the table, plugging in these numbers for x and figuring out that the graph is there. But you do need to know where this 0 point is, because if you just ended up picking numbers like 2, 3, 4, 5, well then you're just going to get a straight line. You need to know where that number bends.